So, welcome to your population web revision. Now, the first thing you need to know is that the population of Scotland increased between 1830 to 1891 from 2.3 million to 4 million. And we're looking at why this increase happened, or the reasons for population growth. So the first reason we're looking at was the Irish potato famine. The potato was a staple crop for many people in Ireland, and when that failed, it meant people were going hungry. So they emigrated to Scotland in the hope that they could find work and therefore feed their families. Medical improvements also reduced the death rate in the 19th century. The discovery of antiseptic and the general advance of knowledge about how disease was spread helped to reduce the number of people dying from disease. People were also marrying younger and having larger families, which increased the amount of people. And there was a reduction in the infant mortality rate. The infant mortality rate is how many people survive early childhood. And because of medical improvements, better hygiene, a number of reasons, this infant mortality rate reduced, which meant there was more people about, which obviously meant which is obviously a reason for the population growth. There was less disease in the second half of the 19th century. This was down to town councils improving water supply, better housing being provided, and better hygiene. Things like cotton started to replace materials such as wool for underwear. This is important because cotton can be easily washed and dried, so therefore it was washed and dried more often than what wool underwear was, and thus improving personal hygiene. People also had healthier diets. This is because fresh food was becoming more available with the introduction of the railways. They could take fresh fish from the coast and fresh dairy products from the farms and take them directly into the town centres, so people had better food. Farming improvements during the 19th century, farmers managed to get higher yields, in other words more crops, and more crops equals more food and healthier diets for people, which has people living longer and thus increases the population. And lastly, a simple mathematical equation: immigration was higher than emigration. In other words, there was more people coming into the country than there were leaving the country. So, population increased from the 1830s up until the end of the 19th century. But then at the beginning of the 20th century to the 1930s, the population began to decrease. Why is this? There was a decline in men after 1918, and there was a decline in the birth rate. The reason there was a decline in men was because of World War I. A lot of men went and fought in the war and died, so there was a decline of them, and this led to a decline in the birth rate. More young men than women emigrated, that means left the country during this time period. And improvements in farming meant that there was less need for a large family to carry out household tasks. Now, during this period, 1830s to 1930s, the population of Scotland moved from the countryside to towns, and this is called urbanisation. So the movement of people from the countryside or rural areas to towns and cities is called this urbanisation. We're going to look at the reasons for this to happen. So new industries were centred in towns. Factories and places of work during the 19th century, such as shipbuilding yards, steel factories, ironworks, were all located in towns. So people were attracted there because that's where the new industries were and that's where the jobs were. New farming methods that we've mentioned before meant they required fewer workers on the farms. They now had more machines that were doing the jobs of previous farm labourers, and they weren't required, so they had to move on to find somewhere work. And closed farming, it's a system of farming that was introduced in the 19th century, which forced families to leave the countryside. Before they had strip farming, and many different families would farm the one bit. Now with enclosed farming, it meant that they had to leave. Now the clearances, otherwise known as the Highland clearances, these happened for a number of reasons. First of all, for sheep farming, because landlords could make more money from having sheep on their land than many crofters, so it meant that they had to go. and also for sporting estates, things like shooting grouse and hunting deer. They cleared the people away from that so that they could create these sporting estates. So these people had to go somewhere, and they went towards the towns. Poverty also drove people from the countryside to the towns. The potato famine also afflicted Scotland, not as bad as in Ireland, but it still happened, and that drove people towards the towns to find work so that they could feed themselves and their family. And also the fall in the prices of Highland cattle. It just meant that people, they weren't, Highland cattle was no longer as valuable as what it had been, so it meant that people had to go to town in search of work. There was also a better standard of living in cities than in rural housing, although, as we've seen when we've studied the standard of living in the 19th century in towns with the slums, there was in general a better standard of living than in rural areas during this time. And the historian T.C. Smout has also demonstrated that the cities were exciting and attractive to young people. So young people who grew up in little villages had a romantic notion of opportunity and excitement about the towns. And that to a certain extent is still true today. Young people growing up in small villages or small towns generally have, or many of them have, an ambition to move towards the bigger towns, as you can see in Glasgow with their colleges and universities and the many people who move from rural areas to Glasgow and Edinburgh in their sort of late teen years. So that's that. See you later.